And with that, I want to hand it over to our program chair, which I have now named her, so Carrie Levitt-Busian, and so that she can introduce Elliott formally for us. And now I will. Oh, one other thing before, sorry, Carrie. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and then I'll read them to Elliott at the end of the talk. Sorry about that, Carrie. Thank you.
No problem. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight at our second virtual UFOP. It is my honor to present our speaker. Elliott Armour Smith is a PhD student in paleobiology at the University of Washington. He is interested in the systematics, evolution, and ontogeny of Mesozoic diapsid reptiles, including archosaurs and plesiosaurs. He is interested in both using both morphological and histological data to shed light on the origins of evolutionary groups, or clades. His master's research at Marshall University focused on the origins of the Western Interior seaway Elasmosaurs. He is also an alumni of the University of Utah with a BS in geology. And most importantly, he was my collections intern, so I take all credit for all of his success. So with that, thank you so much, Elliott, for being our speaker tonight, and take it away.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Carrie. And I'm delighted to be back at a UFOP meeting. And as Carrie alluded to, was an undergraduate at the University of Utah. So UFOP meetings were a fixture of my time there as an undergrad, and my first opportunity to present academic research. So to be back here is just a pleasure. So today I'm going to be presenting some research that I completed as part of my master's thesis at Marshall, as Carrie said in my introduction. And I'm going to focus on this genus Styxosaurus, but also some of its close kin from the late Cretaceous of North America. So let's start off. What exactly is a plesiosaur? So
one second, I think you have to share your screen.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Could you guys not see it? That's really weird. Uh-oh.
I see you. I don't know if I'm the only one.
Okay.
It was in a separate window, so.
I see it now.
All right. Does everyone see PowerPoint now?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So pretty pictures. All right. Great. Let me know if there's any other snafus. All right. So again, yeah, this talk will focus on Styxosaurus, but also some of its close relatives from North America. So let's start off. And what exactly is a plesiosaur? So plesiosaurs belong to, or elasmosaurs that I've been studying for my master's belong to this group Plesiosauria, a group of Mesozoic marine reptiles that are known for their flippered limbs and sort of an underwater flight style of swimming. So they're really sort of a very unique fixture of ecosystems in the Mesozoic marine world. And so on the left, you see sort of an evolutionary tree of different reptilian groups, and we can see where sort of hypothetically plesiosaurs have been placed in that evolutionary tree. So you can see that all living reptiles are now in a group called diapsids. So this is based on the number of holes that you have in your skull. And we can see that synapsids, or the line that leads to mammals, is the outgroup to all other diapsids. So the only thing that's really not accurate about that phylogeny is the position of turtles. So turtles are now regarded as, there's pretty clear evidence that turtles are diapsids. So that little dotted line of sort of that ambiguous placement of turtles can now put them within the diapsid clade, but whether some of these kind of enigmatic groups like ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, turtles. They're very derived in their own respects. So whether they're more closely related to the archosaurs, the group that includes all living crocodilians and all living birds and all the non-avian dinosaurs, or this other group, Lepidosauria, which includes the living, most recent common ancestor of the living groups, the squamates, so the lizards and snakes, and the tuatara. So we don't exactly know where they shake out in that evolutionary tree, but they appear in the Triassic and go through a very rapid diversification, especially right after the end Triassic mass extinction. And then they go extinct at the end Cretaceous. So basically we have two main flavors of plesiosaur. So the first is a plesiosauromorph body type. So this can be characterized as a plesiosaur with very elongate neck and a relatively small head. And so this is Elasmosaurs very much fit this morphotype description. So they are very elongate necks and very small heads. So this sort of Loch Ness monster body plan, if you will. And then the second morphotype that we see repeated in plesiosaur evolution is the plesiosauromorph body type. So this is the short-necked, relatively long skull in most of these animals. So that's the body type that they most are normally take on. So these were once thought to be individual, distinct evolutionary groupings, but the advent of more sophisticated analyses in paleontology that have helped us parse out things like the relationships between different dinosaur groups, those have been applied to the Plesiosaurian tree, and it turns out that they're not just simple groups, that these body types have evolved repeatedly and convergently. So again, here's a broad overview of mostly the Phanerozoic here with its main geologic periods and the three geologic eras. And we can see that the most important interval in Mesozoic marine reptile evolution really starts at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. So we see this transition between forms like nothosaurs and pachypleurosaurs, which kind of have this sort of axial style of locomotion. They would have swam sort of like a lizard, and they had hands and feet that were not modified into flippers. So all of those kinds of a group called Sauropterygians, all of those guys go extinct at the end of the Triassic, and there's just an explosion of diversity amongst plesiosaurians. And then again, you can see that other big dip in diversity there at the end of the Cretaceous, and that's where all the marine reptiles kick the bucket. And then just an aside here, Mosasaurians, so like the guy pictured above the ammonite there on the right-hand side of the red box, those are actually not plesiosaurs. So those fall under the group squamates. So they're within the group that's represented by modern by snakes and lizards. So where they fall in that tree is not exactly certain, but they are definitely squamates. So again, like I said, the end Cretaceous mass extinction spells the end for all the plesiosaurians, including unfortunately the Elasmosaurus. So here's this broad overview of the evolutionary tree of Plesiosauria, and we see repeated evolution of this plesiosauromorph body type. So the Rameliasaurs, one of the earliest radiations of plesiosaurians, they have a really elongate head and not short neck. The pliosaurs really kind of have their heyday in the Jurassic. And then you see other plesiosauromorph groups like the cryptocleidids and the microcleidids. They evolve in the Jurassic. But really, the Jurassic Cretaceous boundary is a really important interval because You see the extinction of a lot of different kinds of plesiosaurs. The cryptoclydids mostly go extinct. And really the two groups that survive, sort of pass through this transition and sort of proliferate in the Cretaceous are the leptoclydids and the Elasmosaurs. The leptoclydids have that plesiosauromorph body type, but they're actually derived plesiosaurians. So again, that's an example of where the cladistics have shown us that there's a lot of convergence going on in this plesiosaurian tree. So somewhere around the Jurassic Cretaceous boundary and shortly into the early Cretaceous, we have the appearance of the first Elasmosaurs in the fossil record. So a little bit of background about Elasmosaurs in general and sort of an important story in their collecting history. The original fossil specimen of what is now known as Elasmosaurus was found in Kansas in 1867 near an army fort called Fort Wallace. So there were some army officers stationed out there. They were kind of out perusing the landscape, and they noticed a very large, what appeared to be set of bones eroding out of some shaly hills of what would later be known as the Pierre Shale Formation. And these officers got in contact with the renowned paleontologist Edward Cope, and he immediately became intrigued in the specimen, wrote back, asked these officers to excavate this for him and send it back on a rail car back to Philadelphia so he could study it. And so you can see on the right there, there's a part of the original plate description of Elasmosaurus. So, but in Cope's haste to publish this specimen to science and claim the credit for it, as was the academic tradition of the day, Cope exactly. Cope, he put the skull, he reconstructed it on the wrong end of this animal and made one of the quintessential and most often cited mistakes in paleontology. So as many of you might know, so there's Cope's original monograph and his reconstruction, which was wrong. So and they even did an art sort of preprint and published it, much to the embarrassment of Cope, because immediately upon his colleagues reading this, they politely ridiculed him in the literature. And I love this quote: Elasmosaurus platyurus, the anatomical characters of the different regions of the vertebral column, they are decidedly plesiosaurian. Professor Cope has described the skeleton in a reversed position to the true one, and in that view has represented it in a restored condition. And that was Joseph Leidy, a contemporary of his day. And basically a polite way of saying he put the head on the rear end. So if Cope got that wrong and the head actually went on the other end, and this was not an animal with a really long tail, but actually an extremely elongate neck and this small head on the end of that tail, there's been a lot of functional interpretations about what that was for. So you'll see this reconstruction in paleo art very frequently, mostly in the sort of antiquated paleo art of previously in the day. So you can see these reconstructions of the neck having this sort of serpentine S-shaped bend to it. But as you can see in the bottom left, some work on the biomechanics and the actual anatomy of plesiosaur necks has shown that this would have been anatomically impossible. So that actually, many of these positions do not show what would have been anatomically capable in life. So they would have had a moderate amount of flexion, but probably not an extreme amount of mobility like we see in, say, the body of a snake. So all these are wrong. They weren't doing this. They weren't rearing their head out of the water like a periscope. They weren't snapping it forward like some sort of rattlesnake trying to capture its prey. They weren't really doing any of that. So if they weren't doing that, then what's the purpose of the long neck? Well, additional functional work and biomechanical work on modeling the shape of plesiosaurs and their necks has shown that it's likely that these longer necked forms swam at slower speeds. So modeling has shown that the longer the neck is, with even just minute variations in moving the head back and forth, there would have been significant drag forces on the neck, and this would have probably required that Elasmosaurs swam at slower speeds. And so this, along with evidence from the anatomy of their skulls, and then also things like stomach contents, kind of corroborate this idea that we see that they probably were eating relatively small prey, things like mollusks, things like small fish, and they were selecting for small prey size. So this has been corroborated with evidence from stomach contents. So we see small prey items like cephalopod mollusks. We see different kinds of fish, both bony and then things like shark teeth within the stomach contents of Elasmosaurs. And then they also, like many other plesiosaurs, swallowed stomach stones or gastroliths, similar to the way sauropod dinosaurs and other archosaurs are renowned for. So now I'll pivot a little bit to my research that I undertook at Marshall, and which focused primarily on the elasmosaurids of the Western Interior Seaway. So for anyone not familiar, the Western Interior Seaway was a shallow inland body of water that covered much of the interior of the central part of North America during the late Cretaceous period. So as you can see there, it split America into two distinct separate land masses, and it also extended at its furthest extent from the Gulf of Mexico all the way north to the Arctic Ocean. So the fossil record of Elasmosaurs in the Western Interior Seaway spans about 35 to 40 million years. There's a high diversity in terms of and geographic area too as well. So as far south as Texas, there's been named taxa, and as far north as Alberta, but also remains covered as far north as Alaska as well. And their highest diversity is found in Campanian age deposits. So these are deposits between about 83 million and about 72 million years old, and deposits in the Great Plains region of North America. So here's sort of this is a paleo artist reconstruction of what that ecosystem would have looked like. And as you can see, it's a sort of foreign marine world, but a very diverse one. We have all kinds of bony fish, all kinds of cartilaginous fish, including sharks and rays, cephalopod mollusks like ammonites and nautiloids, and then other forms as well, bivalves, a whole invertebrate fauna. So Elasmosaurs would have been sort of not the apex predators, but rather a sort of a mid-level macro predator within this marine ecosystem. So on the left, we have a chronostratigraphic chart with all of the known Western Interior Seaway elasmosaurid taxa. And then on the right, we have a paleogeographic map of North America. And then note the time that we have highlighted on the left with the time scale. So about 115 million years ago, the latest part of the early Cretaceous, the Western Interior Seaway hasn't really been fully established, but by the earliest part of the late Cretaceous, it's pretty much completely opened up. So here in the Cenomanian, we have pretty much the full establishment of this seaway, and almost the immediate appearance of large elasmosaurid plesiosaurians. So likely, it can be reasonably concluded that these animals probably evolved. The relatives of what would become later more derived elasmosaurids of the Western Interior Seaway, they probably evolved somewhere else and then moved into this area very quickly as this environment was established. So here's a look at some of their skulls. This is from a paper we recently submitted. And so the animal on the left is known as Thalassemidon hanningtoni from the Cenomanian of Colorado. And then the animal on the right is a specimen called UNSM 50132. And it is from the Cenomanian of Nebraska. So an important point here is that 50132 was originally referred to the genus Thalassemidon hanningtoni, the same genus as the one on the left, by Samuel Wells. And keep that in mind, because what the design of my study was to look at was to include this specimen 50132 in phylogenetic data sets in evolutionary analyses that had been previously published. So this specimen 50132 had been excluded as a taxon of interest, of study in those analyses. So keep that in mind. I'm going to go over what the results from that phylogenetic analysis were. Okay, and then proceeding up through the geologic record, there's one key taxon in the Turonian, and that animal is Libonectes morgani. This is a very well figured skull. This animal has a three-dimensionally preserved skull. So unlike the two that you saw in the previous slide that were very much compressed, had a lot of fractures and breakage, this skull has been cited very frequently because it's remarkably preserved in this three-dimensional state, as you can see in the photograph on the left there. A lot of times these things they're very thin, platy bones, and they compress down and fracture really, really drastically. There's a notable gap in the Coniacian and Santonian of named Elasmosaurid taxa. So there are remains from deposits of this age, but no named taxa. And then the Campanian really sees an explosion of diversity in the Elasmosaurids. So there's actually four different named genera of Elasmosaurid from the Campanian: Styxosaurus, Elasmosaurus, Albertinectes, and Terminator. And Styxosaurus has had several specimens referred to it. So it is the most populated genus of all of these. The rest of them have one occurrence, one species per genus. So here's a look at Styxosaurus snowi as the holotype genus, the type species of the genus, with a figure from our paper on the left-hand side here of its skull. So it's got this very long snout with these teeth that have these really high level crowns, and it would have been perfect for snatching little fish or small mollusks out of the water. And then this is a remarkable fossil. This is an animal called Albertinectes vanderveldi, and it's from Upper Campanian deposits of the Bear Paw Formation in Alberta, Canada. And this animal is remarkable because it has 76 cervical vertebrae in its neck, and that is more than any other vertebrate, living or extinct. And this animal probably reached nearly 40 feet in length, so they got remarkably large. And then the very last occurrence of an Elasmosaurid from North America is this animal, Naconanectes. And what's remarkable about Naconanectes is that it actually has a secondarily short neck. So this animal only had 39 to about 40 cervical vertebrae. So its neck, it evolved from an ancestor with a much longer neck, probably 60 or more cervical vertebrae, and there was a secondary reduction in that neck. So further evidence that that neck length that we see as a pattern is extremely plastic in plesiosaurian evolution. So repeated instances of elongation and reduction of neck length within the family tree of plesiosaurians. And what's also really cool about this specimen is it was found by a hunter on the Charles Russell National Wildlife Refuge. So this man out bow hunting elk was walking down through a ditch and nearly stumbled over what he thought was a dinosaur at first, but what was found later to be an extremely well preserved plesiosaurian. And then also, what's really interesting about plesiosaur evolution, there's this other group very distinct from the Styxosaurian elasmosaurs called the aristonectine elasmosaurs. And their morphology is very distinct from the Styxosaurians. They have these very tiny teeth, dozens of teeth that are about the same size, and this has been interpreted to act as sort of a sieve-like apparatus that would have filtered out small prey items like small invertebrates, small planktonic invertebrates from this sediment at the bottom of the sea. So just a remarkably different adaptation and feeding style in this animal, in these animals, than we do see in the elasmosaurs from the western interior. So we can see a phylogeny there on the left, sort of a schematic phylogeny showing the independent evolution of this sieve-like, sort of baleen whale-like apparatus for filter feeding. And to bring this back to elasmosaurid phylogeny, so we inserted 50132 into already a known data set, a pretty robust data set that's been published about 3 or 4 times in the last 5 years or so, and that this phylogeny has had a lot has held up. And one feature of it is that these aristonectines, or the filter feeding elasmosaurs from the southern hemisphere, they make a group, they make a clade labeled A there, and then also the Styxosaurians appear to make a pretty robust group as well. But what's remarkable about our result of where 50132 is placed is that it actually is recovered within all the other Styxosaurus taxa. So it is actually nested within the genus Styxosaurus, according to our analysis. And in our paper, we actually suggest the naming of a new species of Styxosaurus, and instead referring what had been previously referred to as the Lassamedon to Styxosaurus. So that actually extends the range of this genus and the group, the Styxosaurians, by nearly 10 million years. And really all of these western interior seaway elasmosaurids, and they're all likely Styxosaurians, and they probably evolved near the Jurassic Cretaceous boundary. So this diversification between these two groups probably occurred further back in time than the fossil record currently presents. And I'd like to acknowledge all of the curators who facilitated access to specimens for this research, and all the collection managers who helped me access those specimens, and my co-author, Robin O'Keefe, DJ Morgan, for his help on Styxosaurus browni and some phylogenetic work, my committee members from my thesis, and then also the Marshall University Department of Biological Sciences for providing travel support. And with that, I will take any questions.
Yay, thank you, Elliott. We do have a couple of questions that have been typed into the chat. And I'll start with one from Phil Policelli. And it's, are elasmosaurids known from outside of North America, like from Europe, etc.?
Yes, they are. I only had so many minutes to talk about all of the elasmosaurs, but they're known from every continent. So there's remains found in Africa, from Russia, from Europe. However, those taxa, there's not as many named taxa. So they're there's a lot less known about Elasmosaurs globally. They're definitely most well represented from the western interior of North America, and then probably also from South America. So these ones from the Weddellian seaway of the late Cretaceous. So there's definitely a lot more work to be done on this group globally.
Okay. And the next question, sorry.
Oh, that's all right. I was just wondering if I could see the questions.
They should be in the chat, but I also want to read them off so that people
Wonderful. Yeah.
can hear too. So if you just click, it's probably over on
Got
the
it.
right
Thank
side
you.
of your screen. You can check the chat. So
Okay,
Kelsey
great.
Bridge is asking, do you know if Lake Bonneville was a remnant of or otherwise related to the Western Interior Seaway?
That's a great question. As far as I'm aware, they're not related. So I believe that they're Lake Bonneville and the Great Basin of the modern Great Basin of the United States is related to basin and range tectonics. So that's a lot more recent. So in the last about 40 million years, the western margin of North America went from a subduction zone, so where a oceanic tectonic plate was going under the continental lithosphere, to a transtensional zone like we see in the San Andreas Fault, where the plates are sliding past one another. And I believe that sort of change in the tectonics resulted in the creation of a very large interiorly inward basin that's now the Great Salt Lake. So the Lake Bonneville is a more recent geologic phenomenon, whereas the Western Interior Basin was a much larger basin, and pretty much was basically done by the end of the Cretaceous. So by the Maastrichtian, it's pretty much in full retreat and is no longer in existence.
Okay. And then Carrie Levitt Busian is asking, what part of the mouth of Mortimeria would have been the filter feeding part?
It's a great question. So it's basically, my understanding is that the teeth themselves are and the jaws themselves are interpreted to be filter feeding because of the size of the tooth crowns is so small. So it's, tooth crown size is related to in predatory animals is related to the size of prey capture. So we know that, but also there probably would have had to been something like sort of a pharyngeal apparatus that would have blocked water and sediment from going into the stomach of the animal. So much like the way that crocodiles today can prop open their mouths and prevent water from inwardly going. That's probably what this animal had. But again, it's just a hypothesis. And stomach contents, there aren't any known published stomach contents from these aristonectines. So an analysis of that would probably be able to either confirm or falsify that idea.
Okay, thank you. And then Nathan Ung has a question. You proposed the question, but I don't know if you answered it. Why the long neck? If it slows down swimming and is inflexible, what is the selective advantage? Is it clear?
Yeah, that's it's a good question because it's not really clear, and it's hard to try to understand what the adaptive advantage of that structure was, because there aren't a lot of great analogs. So if we think of long-necked animals today, they have way different ecology. We think of a giraffe or, blurt it out if you can think of another long-necked animal. But the point is that there's not really a modern analog for whatever they did. So this sort of a macro, likely what their ecology was an animal that ate small prey and probably cruised. So that functional implication of that functional work was they probably weren't swimming very fast. So some of the biomechanical work has shown that they were probably using that underwater flight style swimming, and then the neck sort of may have sort of drifted back and forth. Think of like a fishing pole or something like that. So allowing the neck to move relatively independently from the body. So that's, but again, that's all interpretation. However, that evolved, that plesiosauromorph, that long neck evolved much earlier in the Jurassic. So we see a plesiosaurus with that body type. So there clearly was something advantageous about it, even if we haven't exactly figured that out.
Okay. And then someone with a log name of Beta 0 says, I gotta ask, what's your favorite plesiosaur and or dinosaur?
That's a great question. I would have to say Styxosaurus, just from the amount of time that I've spent with it, and hopefully this our manuscript goes through, and I'll have named a species. We'll see if that holds up.
Cool. And then PJ Stamler is asked, just compiling a list of questions. So he's got one. Do we see niche partitioning in Championian Elasmosaurs?
I think that Campanian.
Campanian, sorry.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that this group is likely really diverse. So the fact that we see that really long, one thing I didn't point out was that that short-necked form, Naconanectes and Albertanectes, lived alongside one another. They're found in the same geologic unit, so they were living at the same time. So they likely were niche partitioned. So in the way that they probably were had different. You could speculate that these animals had different prey preference, given that different length of neck probably had functional and ecological implications. So they probably were eating different things. It's hard to say. No one's ever tested that. And then the question about modern baleen whales using their tongue to push out water. So what do we see with their function in Elasmosaurs? Well, again, there's been a little bit of work done on soft tissue reconstruction, but mostly kind of like the mechanics of the skull. But it's really hard to reconstruct soft tissue, especially in a group that has no living representatives. So a lot of this work trying to reconstruct, maybe what did the soft tissue look like in dinosaurs? Well, at least you can use a method where you look at the most closely related things. So think of, it's called a method called extant phylogenetic bracketing. So you take, if you want to know what a dinosaur's soft tissue looked like, you look at modern birds, and you look at a crocodilian, and then you compare and contrast the differences. But in the case with plesiosaurians, they have no living representatives. So you're kind of starting from scratch from a tissue reconstruction point. So it's highly speculative, and again, like a lot of Elasmosaur research, there's still so many things we don't know about this group.
Okay. And then Tracy Thompson is asking, on the phylogeny you showed at the end, is there something to suggest that the SDSM, I think it was, specimen may not belong to the genus Styxosaurus, but may be a basal offshoot lineage, and that your specimen might be as well?
Yeah, that's I like that question because it shows that actually isn't necessarily a result I would have predicted. That specimen of it was SDSM 451. It's referred to Styxosaurus snowi in another publication. I was not expecting that to be the most basal member. That could be to a number of factors in this analysis. It could be because there's slightly fewer characters scored in that for that taxon. It could be just from some slight differences. I wouldn't have expected that, but I think what it says more is that there's definitely we don't have the relationships fully parsed out. But I would I think that all of those 4 members, so all of those specimens, all of those taxa of Styxosaurus, all of those species, and 50132, those consistently came out in my analysis as a grouping, as a clade. So I think that's support for this genus being a long-lived and relatively successful one evolutionarily.
And PJ also asks, Elasmosaur neck length is way higher than many other plesiosaurs. Did these taxon obtain that length independently, or is this the basal condition of the elasmosaurids?
That's an excellent question. So an elongate neck is certainly a basal condition of the elasmosaurids. So the earliest known elasmosaurid taxon from the early Cretaceous of South America has about 55 neck vertebrae. And then we see that subsequent elongation, and then like Cononectes sees that reduction in its neck length. So so it's probably it's way higher than in plesiosaurians, and it evolved that yeah, and we see that pattern as well. But so at the beginning of plesiosaur evolution, that's another question we don't know, is sort of what did the basal condition look like, and what were those routes? So how many times did that plesiosauromorph body type evolve, and how many times did the plesiosauromorph body type evolve? We still figuring that out.
And of course, since I'm reading these in order, I just noticed Elaine Jones's comment that if you click the stop presenting button at the bottom, you'll come full screen. There you go.
Okay.
Yeah. And then Abigail Ryder says, what I'm hearing is we need to do a field trip to find Nessie. And I must admit, I always think of Nessie when I see plesiosaurs. So I have a question.
Give me a call if you find him.
Yeah, right? Maybe they're here. Maybe he swam over here. And I do have a question. If plesiosaurs were the mid-range predator, who was above them?
So that in the late Cretaceous, Western Interior Seaway, elasmosaurs got really large, so they probably were pretty high in the food web. But mosasaurs really take the world, and especially that Western Interior Seaway ecosystem, by storm. So they're not present in the early part of the late Cretaceous, but about the middle of the late Cretaceous, so about 90 million years to about 85 million years, they take to the water and diversify, become very large in body size, and then become really the dominant predators in the latest Cretaceous marine ecosystem. So those are things like Tylosaurus, so the Tylosaurians. So they did not get a Jurassic World size, Godzilla size, but they were pretty formidable apex predators.
Cool. All right. And mosasaurs for the win from Joshua Lively. Funny. Anyway, well, if anybody wants to make any comments or questions, please feel free to unmute at this time and just call it out. You have a lot of people thanking you on chat, so do check that out. And I wish to thank you as well, Elliott. Anybody else? And Carrie says, what? Jurassic World lied to us? Anyway. Okay, well, thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. I appreciate you all showing up. Thank you.
And thanks, everyone, for coming. And we'll see you again next month. We've got
Good to
another
see everybody.
speaker lined up. Bye.
Thank you, Elliott.
Thank you. Thanks, Carrie. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Elliott.
Thank